and I want you to find all of your lining pieces. You should have your lining for your sleeve, your lining for the back, and then in the felt still you're going to have a left and a right front as well still. So let's have all of those together. Now this is going to be much quicker because we've not got any patches to put on or any yokes to put on or pockets. That's going to be nice and easy. So let's take our, first of all, let's take our back. Let's take our pattern piece off and put that into our bag so we keep that nice and safe and together. We can open that out. If you want to change your thread colour, then you can do, of course. And then we're going to take our, this is our left front. So again, pattern piece into here. And we're going to then, that's got our right side noted. We don't need these tailor's tacks on this part, so we can take those out because we needed those to go through for the pocket, didn't we? Before, but there's no pocket on the inside, so we've got the pin showing the right side, so the right side's going to go down so the shoulder seams match. Put a couple of pins in there to hold that together, and then we're going to take our right front, take the pin off that one, and again we can take our tailor's tacks out of this side. So we did put them in both sides, and I still would say to do that because sometimes it takes more brain power, well, just for me anyway, I don't know how you guys are, but it takes more brain power for me to try and work out which is the ones I'm going to use left and right first off, and then just isolate those for the tailor's tacks, than it does just to go through both and cut them out and then cut through the bridge of threads and then just to give me my resultant sides that I need. So that's what it's going to look like when they're pinned on. So now let's go to our machine, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're just going to reverse at the start and stop. Take our pins out as we go. And when you're sewing a lining like this, and where we're going to be bagging it out, this is why it's so important to get the same seam allowance, because if you have a different seam allowance here or on the side to the one that you've used in the coat, if it's a bit too much or a bit too little, your lining isn't going to fit in perfectly, and obviously we want that lining to fit in as perfectly as possible. So do make sure, pay attention, even though it's, you might say, oh, it's just the lining, it doesn't matter. Actually, it really does, because it's going to contribute to the overall look of your finished garment. Needle how to work, and then take the threads off again. So we've got that back lining on with our two fronts here. Let's just finger press these seams open, just to hold those open for us. Much easier without the yokes on, isn't it? And we've no hood to put on, so we're straight onto the sleeves. So again, we're going to take our sleeve pattern. Now, before we do anything else, the first thing I want you to do is just go to the sewing machine, not sewing machine, the iron, and I just want you to press up just 1/4 inch on the bottom of these, just with your iron. Don't sew them down at all, just press up 1/4 inch on the hem edge of your lining, because that will make it easier when we come to put these in later. So let's just do that first. Let me get my iron. It's much easier to do these kind of things whilst you've not got your garment attached to your sleeve attached to your garment, your piece that you're working with. And I like to I've just eyeballed that at 1/4 inch, and I've just attached it just onto my ironing board with my pins. And I do like to pin into this pressing mat. It works really well for that. A bit of steam on, so that gives it a really nice crease. So that's one done. Oops, iron likes to tip over. I dropped it after in the first week I had it, it fell on the floor, and it's got two little legs on the edge here, look, and I've dropped one off, so it tends to roll into the centre. But never mind, it still works really well, so it's perfectly imperfect. Right, there's the second one on there. So let's just put our press marks into that. And this will give it a memory for us, which will make it much easier when we come to doing the next section. Oh, iron feels a bit hot. Okay. So there we go. So we've got those 2 hems now on the bottom there. Right, so I finished with the iron for now, so I can pop that to one side and pop that away. Then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put those gathering stitches around the top here, and because the thread is light blue, I'm going to use that same thread. So let's take our tension back down to 2 so it loosens off our stitches, and we're going to take our stitch length up to 3 again like we did. And then I'm just going to do 2 rows of stitching just exactly as before, needle in the work just to anchor that down while we pivot. And that's going to give us our gathering stitches to make sure that our sleeves gather into our arm side the same way as before. And I'm going to put these sleeves in exactly the same way again, tack them in and then sew those in so that they then will fit in nicely. Okay, so if you want to do the same, and so once we've got those gathering stitches in and we've pulled them up slightly, then we're going to go to find our centre notch on our lining sleeves. There it is, okay, and that's going to go against the centre point on the sleeve head. And then we're going to match up the underarm, so we've got the right sides together for the lining. Attach that on that point there, and then we're just going to ease those gathers just so that it's the same length, and if you have to gather it up slightly more as I need to on this one. And you might find that your lining fabric is slightly trickier to work with in terms of not getting any puckers in it than your felt was, and that's completely normal. So the felt has got a real nice natural give to it, whereas your cotton thread you've got to coax into place with your fingers. So you might need some more pins, or you might need a little bit more tacking, smaller tacking stitches perhaps, but so long as you've not got any puckers on that 1/4 inch point there. So although we've got puckers beyond it, because there's nothing going to be on that 1/4 inch seam allowance there, then I know that's good to go. And let's do the same thing. Oh, I've got my sleeve inside out, look. Well, that was a rookie error, wasn't it? Right, find my notch again, pop that against there. So, right side is in towards the coat, and you can see which is the right side because you've got your seam allowance there, so they can match on. I think it's because it's a pale fabric on both sides. Okay, let's just match that up again. So I tend to match the middle point and the starting and the stopping points first, and that then tells me how much I need to either gather it up or to release it to fit it in. And then I can see where there's some puckers, and I can make sure that I ease that around so that it'll sit nicely and flat. Raw edges together. And that just goes onto there like that. And I am going to tack this again because it was definitely easier having that tacked edge. And then again on this side. Okay, so we're just exactly, as I said, exactly the same as we did with the felt before. Just be aware that the fabric of your lining, if you've used a cotton lining like I have, this is a quilting cotton, is slightly more tricky to place, but it's totally doable. So you can do this. I have every confidence in you. And then once we've got there, and if I do get a little pucker on the inside, I'm not going to be too precious about it. Obviously I can go in and I can take that out again if I want to, but for now it is a lining on a coat, so and I don't think anybody's going to scrutinise it that hard. But again, you've got to work within the tolerance that you're happy with. If you're somebody who's very particular, then by all means just take that extra time and just make sure that you get all of those little lines out of it. But if you're somebody who isn't so fussed, then obviously you can let that go. But in the future, it might bother you, but just on the day that you're having today, you might be quite happy. So you have to just do what you're comfortable with your sewing. So let me just take some tacking threads, tack this, and then I'll sew it, and then I'll do the other one as well. and we'll get those 2 lining sleeves in, and then we'll be sleeve linings in, and then we'll be moving on to the next stage, which we're sewing down the side seams. But I want somebody to remind me when we get further down to doing those side seams that we don't need to sew all down one side, because that's where we're going to turn it through. Okay, back to you in a minute. Okay, so once we've then got our 2 sleeves in where we were before, so let's just get our orientation. There's the back of our lining. Here's the 2 front facing pieces, but they're part of the lining, and the 2 sleeves. We're now going to fold the right sides together to match those underarm seams. And on the first side, we're going to sew all the way down. So let's put a pin in at the underarm point. Now what I want you to do is just open out, see where we've folded over the little hem edge, open that out, so you're not sewing it closed folded, you're sewing it closed when it's flat out. So put those raw edges together, that's your start point. And then we're going to go down to the bottom of the hem again on here on the jacket, and we're going to sew that again down the bottom there. Got a little bit of a difference on mine, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. So that's there. Okay, and I'm going to sew all the way down this one. On the next one though, we're going to use the red pin trick, and we're going to leave a section open. So let's pin it now, and then we'll sew them both together. So let's go to the underarm point again, and we're going to match where the linings and the lining and the felt transitions. So that's there. Put a green pin. Let's open out that hem, that cuff again, and make sure that we sew that open. And then let's go down to our hem and match our hem up. Don't want that colour, let's have a black one. Okay. Now, between here, I'm going to leave about that section, so it's about 1.5 inches, 2 inches. So let's put a red pin one side. And measure how much I'm leaving. Yeah, about 1.5 inches, and put another red pin the other side. So the red pins will tell me where to start and stop. So on this side, I'm going to sew all the way down, and on this side I'm going to sew down until I get to my red pin, and then reverse to close off, then break my threads, join back again at this red pin and join my threads and go get down to this bottom hem edge, and then reverse stitch again. And that's going to leave us that little section for turning this through. So this is the edge we're going to go all the way down with. Let me move my needle position so it's in the right place for me. My 1/4 inch. So 1/4 inch seam allowance again. Put that needle in the work. And it's just as we did with the front of the duffel coat, we're going to stop right on the seam line of that. That's it. Seam line at that underarm point. Use as many pins as you need to in order to make this sit nicely. Remember to reverse on the bottom. So that's the first side all the way down. Second side, well, I'm going to start from the, oh no, I can't do it this way around. I've got my pins. Right, let's hold on to this. Let's reverse and start stitching. Again, we're going to stop on that underarm point, so I've got my coat pulled out so my sleeve's nice and flat so I can see where I'm going to. One more stitch, that's it, and then pivot, change direction, and I'm going to stop at this first red pin. So down towards the red pin, I'm going to remove it, but remember where I was roughly, and then reverse. Threads off, take off those starting threads while we're there, and then back in again to the second red pin. Make sure your raw edges are together as much as possible. I've got my lining is just a smidge shorter than the other, so I'm just I'll bear that in mind when I'm sewing my garment together, and then take that section out. So you've got this very deliberate hole in the side seam just there, look. and that's where we are going to turn everything through when it comes to it. Hopefully we can get the hood through there. It should be all right. Well, I'll put a note on the screen if you need to leave longer than that so that you know. That's one thing that I do. Right, so we now have our lining. Just open up these side seams where that cuff is. Don't need to neaten any of this because it's all going to be hidden inside your coat. So just neaten, just fold that cuff over just like that where you've just sewn it. So that puts that cuff edge back into place on both sides, and that's ready to go. And then we can poke this through. So, oh no, we'll leave this the wrong side actually because we're going to be putting it up against the actual coat itself. Right, so now we're going to go back to getting our original coat, and we've got our lining inside out. We're now going to poke a sleeve through the lining sleeve. Put our finger and thumb in to grab that. And then we're going to match those underarm seam points together. This is just to get everything all lined up and make sure nothing's twisted. Just make sure that all sits nicely. And then you want to tuck the hood's got to be tucked in, but you're then going to be looking for your shoulder seam that's underneath your hood, and that's one of your match points just there. So let's then put a pin through. Now, because we've tacked the hood to the front of the jacket, you don't have to put your pin all the way through. So long as it's through into that hood section, you should be fine. And then we can go across this front area here, pins in, down to the front hem, put a pin in. Those are your match points. Let me just go through that again. So I've poked my felt arm through my lining sleeve, through the sleeve there, and I'm matching these front edges up together because this has got to be all nice and neat. And I've matched up the shoulder seam, but my hood is sandwiched in between. So the lining shoulder seam and the coat shoulder seam is together, and the hood is pushed into the inside. Let's go over to the other side and let's poke that sleeve in as well. So it gives us like a first point to try and orientate this coat together. And then find our shoulder seam of our lining and match it up as best as we can with the shoulder seam of our outer coat. This is going to be really thick, folks. We're going to have to just take our time with this, and it might be better to tack this as well. Centre back is going to the centre back on the back of the actual coat there, on the back of the hood. That can just get lined up, so that's all fine. And then we're on to this other section here on the front here, so you're going to line that all up. And it should, if your seam allowances are right, should line up just perfectly for you. Down to the bottom of the hem again. Match that all up. And again, down this centre front here, we're putting all of those seams together. If you have a walking foot for your sewing machine, you might want to put it on for sewing this, because that will keep everything together. And then along the bottom here, we're now going to match up the seams here. And I'd have those front seam allowances pointing towards the centre back. And then again just to here, so those seam allowances pointing to the centre back. So they're on top of each other. Let's match that centre back, just make sure that's lying nicely. And then just another pin just in there. So what you've ended up with, if you can see, is you've ended up with your lining having the sleeve of your main coat poking through. The hood is tucked inside this section here. So this is going around the back of the neck there. And then the fronts just line up and along the bottoms line up. And because we've got this section left open just here, that's where we're going to turn it through once we've sewn it and put everything through correctly. And that's going to work really nicely for us. So we're going to do that section next. We're going to sew all of this, but you've just got to be, I might tack around this back of this neck because I think that's likely to shift on me. Around the front here, that's all nice and even. It's just this bit through here because you've got your coat, your yoke, you've got two sections of your hood, the inner and the outer, and then you've actually got your lining piece as well. So I think that that would be a good idea just to, is that thread going to be long enough? Yes. Let's just tack along there and that will just hold that together for us then. So I'm going to start my tacking just where the hood is. I don't need to tack really where the actual front lapel is, because that's not so thick. So let's tack this section just here, and you can see just even getting my hand sewing needle, that wasn't big enough, hand sewing needle through, that it's got quite a thickness to it. And I'll show you a little trick on your machine that you might not be aware of as well. Depends how many of my videos you've watched. Just make sure your raw edges are lining up properly. And you shouldn't have any risk of pucker along here, I don't think, because it should all just sit very nicely on top of one another and together. We're nearly getting to the exciting bit, and where will we put it? We've got to put the front cover guard on, haven't we, first, which will be interesting. So I'm not looking forward to turning that piece out, but I've got a plan B if it is difficult to turn out. And then we've then got the toggles to put on, which will make it look, that's definitive, isn't it, really, of a duffel coat, isn't it, when it's got the toggles on it. So I'm tacking that all the way through to there. And I can just manage a double stitch through there, I think. Okay, take my needle off. Let's take those pins out just there, because we don't need those because we've tacked. So there we go. So the pins around the edge, because that's much easier to sew, and then this here will all go through and around and about. So I'm going to move my needle so that it's across. So I've only got a bit of my presser foot that's going to be actually on my garment for this section. Let's start down at the bottom, because we can hide our stitches better down there, can't we? So let's go onto our seam allowance here. Take the first pin out, and then let's just load there. Needle into the work, so we've got everything anchored down. Pins out as we go. If seam allowance is starting to flick up, so if I just lift up my presser foot and put that down, then that's going to keep everything all nice and neat for me. So now we're going to have this corner on top of each other. We're going to just guesstimate where that 1/4 inch is for the turn. About there. Maybe one more stitch. So that's better. Okay. Up the front here. Again, just estimate where you need to for that stitch. Now this is the section you've got to be careful with, so just take your time. Try and keep to 1/4 inch. You can hear the machine just starting to struggle slightly. You can always use your awl as well if you need to, just keep the bulk of your fabric out of the way. I'm going to get a pucker there, so I'm going to lift up my presser foot and just move some of the fabric out of the way so that we can hopefully skip the point of pucker. Keep that hood in there. Seam allowance starting to misbehave again, so let's just hold that down. Straighten everything out. I'm going to go down the front here. take that 1/4 inch again, and across the front, and then we'll reverse where we started. Let's take the starting and stopping threads off. Do that in one go, I think. And this is what we're left with. So we've got our coat sewn all the way around the outside now. Now before we turn it round, should we do the sleeves yet? Let's leave the sleeves for the moment just in case it doesn't work. Okay, so we want to trim off these corners because that's going to be bulky. So let's just trim those off. We just do them slightly more than 1/4 inch, but we go up to but not through our stitches. So let's do on all of those corners. And if you've got anywhere where you can snip off a little bit of seam allowance, especially on the felt only, oh, bits of felt flying all over the place, then that will help everything lie down a little flatter. So I'm just taking those, so where I've got like a seam like here, I've got a little bit here that's not needed. So if I snip it off like that at an angle, we don't compromise the end of the seam, but we've just taken out that extra bit of seam allowance. That one's got folded over, so that won't count. Okay, I'm happy with that. Let's get rid of all these bits. Okay, let's have a look. Let's see if we can get our coat through this section here. So it's going to, let's try with the hood first. We know the hood is the bulkiest part, so let's get the hood through first. And just try not to tug too hard to start off with. Let's help that hood through. And the hood's through, okay, that's good. Okay. So then we're going to start and work on some of the other sections to get it through. And it's always a balance between trying to, and this always looks quite brutal when you're trying to get things turned through. It's trying to make sure that you don't stretch out that inside edge of the coat, of the felt. So you want enough room to get everything through, but not so much room you've got a big hole to try and close up at the end. Let's just ease all of this out. So this technique is called bagging out. Just take your time with it, try not to yank anything too hard. And sort of pull your opening fabric back so you can pull things through. Just keep spinning it round, and a little bit of pushing, a little bit of tugging, a little bit of gentle persuasion too. You should start to see that through. So now we can get hold of an arm, look. Let's pull a sleeve through, that will help. Get rid of some of the bulk. Let's go on to the other side, let's get the other arm through. That's it. It's going to look very crinkled once we've done this, but we can press this, don't forget, at the end. But when you're pressing your final garment, I would always use a press cloth as well. So either a handkerchief, you know, a fabric handkerchief, or a bit of an old pillowcase, or a bit of an old scrap of fabric you've got that's a cotton. You want 100% cotton, or that 100% silk organza that I use is really, really good. So you can see how much I'm having to push and persuade this coat to come through. Let's turn our corners out, make sure they're doing nicely. There's another bit, and magically your coat starts to appear. Let's push those corners out. Just get them all wiggle, and it helps to get those corners through for now. You can push those through in a bit with a knitting needle or whatever. So we're getting there. Okay, there we go. We've kind of got our coat looking something like it should. We've still got a little bit of persuasion to do on some of these edges. Let's get a nice big pin. We can just coax out those corners, can't we? hoping I've not knocked my camera. I've just noticed it's slightly off. Centre of where I thought I'd got it. So hopefully you've been able to see all of that. There we go. Okay, we are getting there. Just be careful you don't flick out any of your fibres when you're using a pin to turn your corners. Just be nice and gentle with them. So, everything's looking quite nice, but a few errant threads. That lining looks quite nice, I'm happy with how that looks. I'm just going to finger press that onto the edge of the actual coat itself. And we've got our section here, which we're going to close up by hand shortly. That's just threads there. So my felt has stretched out slightly, as you can see, but I'm hopeful that when I actually sew that in, I can sew that in enough that it'll lie flat enough to not be noticeable. As you can see, it's trying to pucker up on me, so I just need to take that nice and steady. Okay, so now we need to get our sleeves sewn the right way through. So what we're going to do is we are going to push the felt sleeves through into the lining sleeves. Let's pull our lining through first. And you'll see that one sleeve is slightly longer than the other. We've got that lining in there, haven't we? So we're going to turn over the felt by 1/4 inch. It's hard to iron felt in creases into felt, like that. And then we're going to match up the edge of our lining fabric so that it's not quite at the edge, but it's near enough. And then we're going to hand slip stitch that into place, just so that when we turn it back round, but you don't want your line, well, sorry, let me finish what I was saying. So when you turn it back round, the lining is not visible poking out the end. So can you see how I've got a bit of an edge there? Okay. So pop that in there. And we can just slip stitch that close. So I'm just slip stitching it short of the thing. Just be careful you don't go all the way through to the outside. You don't want to see your stitches on the outside. You just want to have them just very gently just going around the inside there. And then once you've done that, you can poke your sleeve through to the other side, and that will be your sleeve finished off. So let's have a go at doing that so you can see. Into some thread and get a needle. See if I can thread it quickly. Yes, there we go. So you only need it to be single, I think. You don't need it to be double thread. Let's put a knot at the end. Okay, so I'm going to go, just move the lining out of the way so I can just bury my knot just on the inside. So let's come through on that seam allowance just there. And I'm just going to do a little stitch in place just to anchor that thread down. That's some edges of the... So then I'm going to take a little stitch out of the edge of my cuff on my lining, and then a little stitch out of the edge of my cuff on my outer coat. So just going across the edge just like that. And these little stitches will just hold that lining in place. And I've got my finger inside my cuff so I can feel if I go too far with my needle. Just want to catch a few fibres of the felt, and that will just neaten that off just nicely. I'm just going all the way around, so just little stitches as you can see just there. hand stitching is another thing, a bit like the gathering stitches that I spoke about earlier, that with practice it takes time to get you neat little even stitches. It is worth practice. I'm going to say practicing. I don't ever sort of take out something and just stitch just for no reason. I mean, you may do if you wish to, but I don't avoid hand stitching. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And so the more that you do it, the more proficient you get at it, and the neater and the smaller stitches it will be. You know, use your glasses if you need to, because that will help you get the right number of threads as well when you're doing your stitching. And it can be a really nice finish, especially on a hem. I know it seems, again, people feel like they've not got time to hand stitch a hem, but the difference it can make is huge. So let's just go all the way around here, and I'll do the other one exactly the same way, and that will just attach that lining to the bottom of those sleeves. On an adult garment, you can do this from the inside. Generally, you'll find a seam down here on one of your arms of a jacket that have, that have been that's been sewn up from the outside, and then you know that that's where people go in if they're going to. If I have to shorten cuffs for a jacket for me or for Rob, then I look for the arm that's got the hole on it. Not the hole. It's not a hole. It's sewn up from the outside. Perhaps that's something you could do one day. Just go and have a look in your wardrobe and have a look in a side of jacket, and you should see like where it's been buttered up together and then hand sewn. You know that that's where you go in to sort shorten your jacket sleeves. Okay, so let's snip that thread off. So that's how it's looking at the end there. And then when I poke this through from the other side, we've got a beautifully finished cuff where the lining isn't poking through. So that's looking all nice on that side. So I'll just do the other side and get that one to the same stage, and then I am going to sew down here using exactly the same stitch, making sure that that's all sitting all nicely inside there as well. So that's going to get stitched together nicely. I'll probably give it a quick press at that stage then, because I think everything is pretty much in place as to where it needs to be. So just make sure you can't see your lining. Make sure your lining doesn't poke down on the bottom like that. We need it just to be slightly in towards the inside of the jacket, the duffel coat. Because the next thing we're going to have to do is put this cover strip on that goes down the front, which is the last piece we've got, which is this one. And this one could be interesting. I think I'm going to try this 2 ways, because then I can report back and see how it actually works. But I've got a trick for turning that out if it'll work, and we'll have a look at working with that, because then we'll be onto our toggles. We'll be doing some top stitching, and we'll be onto our toggles, and then we'll be finally finished. So we're getting there. Okay, so I've got both of my cuffs now neatened off on the inside. That's both those two. So now I'm just going to slip stitch closed the little gap that we used to turn the coat through, and I'm probably going to suggest that you leave a 2-inch gap here instead of the 1.5 that I left, because whilst I could turn it through with a little bit of wiggling, it has stretched out this little bit of felt just here. So I think if you leave 2 inches, I think you'll just get a nicer, you'll manage it more easily, is what I'm trying to say, without stretching the felt on that edge quite so much. So I'm just I folded under the 1/4 inch on the lining, and then I'm just overlapping it the same amount. I'm trying to just move my stretched felt in slightly so that I don't get a pucker on that edge. And then I'm just using that little slip stitch that I just showed you just to close that up as well, with little stitches just along this edge here. And that will just then get that nice and ready. So I'm just trying to go through the edge of the lining and a little bit through a few fibres on the inside of the coat, but without being too obvious, right on that edge if you can, so it's almost invisible. I've changed to a little cream thread as well, just to match the lining fabric. So that should help just disguise those stitches as well. Okay, the next thing then we're going to be working on is the little cover band that we need to use. And as I say, I'm going to have two ways of doing this one, I think. And then you can choose which way you want to do it. Right, I'll just finish this off, just get this nicely closed up so that you hardly see it. And you'll only notice it if you're looking for it. If you're not looking for it, you won't see it. And then we'll be ready just to do that cover band. Okay, back in a second. Okay, so the first way I'm going to try and do this button band is we're going to do the method that it says in the pattern. So if you really like following exactly as it says in the pattern, then this is what we're going to do. The second way is going to be Claire's alternative way if I can't get a good enough result on this when I do it, because I'm a bit concerned about sewing it and then turning it round. All become clear. So it's this long thin strip here, and it's the bit that goes on here underneath those toggles just there. Can you see there's like an extra bit that's got a long rectangle that's got this top stitching around it. So what we're going to do is, I've got my pins in to show me which is the right side. So I've got right sides together on the two pieces, and I did add a 1/4 inch seam allowance around all of these edges. And I'm going to sew it, but I'm going to turn it, but then have a gap halfway down on one side that I'm going to leave open. Now, because I know that I want to turn this through, I'm going to use a method that I've seen on the internet for turning things through. And I'm getting two long pieces. Now, if you're one of my followers, you might have bought some extra strong thread from me at some stage, which I use for sewing on my characters' arms and legs. It's a Coats Epic 050 on here. Coats Epic 050, and it's really, really strong. It's like an upholstery weight thread, but it's just super, super strong. So that's what I use for sewing my arms and legs on with. But then I'm making a loop, so I'm doubling up a length of thread, probably about just over 1/4 meters maybe of that, but it's going to go, I'm going to pin it at each end of my band with a loop in between. So if you can see, I've got that thread showing through in the centre there, and then there's a loop on it. So I'm going to pin that in place and then have it coming down to about halfway down the centre, and then it's going to then poke out at the centre. Just put some pins in just to hold this together. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same with another piece. I've got another piece there, so I've got long tails, look, hanging out. And this, what it should do, if I explain what I'm trying to do for all those people looking at me and thinking, what on earth is she doing? Is I'm going to use these as little pulls to try and pull this fabric through, because it's so skinny, this little piece of felt, and because felt doesn't run against each other very well, it's not silky fabric, is it? So it doesn't slide against each other very well. Then if I put that into the middle so it doesn't get caught in any of the other stitches, and then pin it again, then I'll be able to open it up through that and then hopefully pull the ends of the band through. That is the theory. So I'm going to start at one side here, down to the bottom, across there. Now I've left a gap between my two strands because I want some stitches to form in between, so that loop catches hold of some stitches. Then all the way down here, same across the bottom, and end up at that pin again. So let's pop this in, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take that first pin out now that I've got that positioned. And then we're just going to sew that down. I'm going to reverse at the start and stop again. Take your pins out as you get to them. Going to pivot at the end just here. So I don't have to go too far. And across. Doing the work. And then down the other side. across the bottom and across that other loop. And then down this side again. Remembering to stop where that pin was. Right, so take those starting and stopping threads off without cutting the tails of the sort of tan thread that I've got. I want to keep those on and intact. Okay, so this is what I've got. So I've got my loop over through the end, and I've got some stitches, so I know that that loop's got caught on the stitches. And again down here I've got my other loop caught. First thing I'm going to do is, making sure I don't cut through the loop, is I am going to trim off some of this seam allowance, because I think that's going to be key. So certainly in the corners we want to take off the seam allowance there. And again down this side, just make sure you're not going to cut through your thread, otherwise we'll be in trouble. Okay, so I've got some of that seam allowance, and then I'm going to pull on the thread, and that should pull this loop down inside. See it pulled it down inside, and the same with the other side. So that should pull it down. Right. Then what I'm going to do is I am now going to pull on my thread, and can you see that all starting to bunch up? I want to pull on that, and we've got to tuck the felt down inside itself, inside the tube that we've just sort of sewn. And I'm hoping that this will pull this felt inside and create the tube for me. Now if you've got turning tools, I know Prim do some turning tools, don't they? You might well be able to use that. But this is what I was concerned about, it working. I think Claire the designer might have more skills than me, because I'm not sure I can get that to turn. But I'll keep trying, I've not given up yet. Keep going. But as you might guess, there's always more than one way of doing things. And maybe let's just try taking down some of this seam allowance a little bit on the sides here. It might make it easier. Just make sure you don't go through your thread that you've got threaded in the middle. Or don't compromise your stitches either. So that's got that one down. Let's go this side now. I'm going to pull this top end up so we can just take some of that seam allowance off, but I'm just going to be really careful not to cut through my loop. Okay, let's try again. So cutting down the seam allowance is what I've just done. Let's see if that will pull it through for me a little bit better. And sometimes we have to trial and error things the way that a designer has intended, because they will have done this. So it is possible, because they have produced garments with this band on the front of their clothing. Can you hear me concentrating? Let's get a pin, see if I can. It's about getting it started. Once you can sort of get that first little bit over the top and poked in on the inside, generally speaking, it will start to turn in on itself. Come on, you can do it. Oh, it's starting to go. I can tell. Can you see it's starting to go inside itself? So I'm holding on to the threads, and then I'm pulling on the edge of on the end that's been sewn, and that's slowly pulling it through. Right, so it is working. Okay, so trimming down the seam allowance is your key. And then not pulling it too much before the other felts had time to go over the end, I think. Okay, so that's one bit out. just one side out. And then once you've got your side out, you can just hold on to your thread and you can just pull it out, and that is then done with. So now I can pull out to find the squared ends. So I can flatten that down now. And I'll double check as well to make sure that's the right length for the right width for the button band when we get to the end. So now I'm just going to trim the seam allowance down, because that was key to making everything work better. Just make sure when you trim off the seam allowance at the end, you're not going to compromise your thread that you need to pull on. And try not to trim too much on the bit you've got to close. Right, let's go back again then. Let's find our other end. And then if we sort of create a bit of a tube ourselves by sort of pushing in on the sides of the seam allowance, we can see that that's going to start and turn. And once we've done one and we know it's possible, generally the other side goes like a dream. Why the first one doesn't go like a dream, I never know, but the second one does start to. This is where you need your patience. Because if you put it too tight, it just doesn't start to go at all. Where's my... Oh, let me just see if I can push some of that in with the end of that without making a hole. You've got to be careful, you don't compromise the ends of your cover strip by making a hole in your fabric. So use the end of a knitting needle, not the pointy end, the blunt end of a knitting needle to get it started as well if you need to. Come on. Right, there we go, it's coming now. So as you can see, it does take a little bit of coaxing, but you can do it. Right. Once it's through, let's take that thread out as well, it just comes really easily out. And then we're now going to just pull out so we've got those squared edges to the top and bottom of it. And I just coax it out with a pin, that usually works fairly well for me. Flatten it out with your fingers, so you want all of your seam allowance, sort of your seam edges ought to be right on the very edge there. You're going to have a bit in the middle here, we just need to just flatten out slightly and coax with our fingers. And then what we're going to do now is tuck in that seam allowance to the 1/4 inch on both sides. So it's the same length all the way down, and you'll be able to see where your stitches are. And now we're just going to do a little ladder stitch just to close that too. So let's get some pale blue thread. So let's just thread our needle, oops. And we're going to slip stitch that little opening closed. So I hope you've managed to turn yours round. I'm going to show you a different way of doing it if that just doesn't work for you at all, because there are some people that it might not work for, and you could see it was quite fiddly for me too. That's what you want in this long thin strip really of felt. So let's find where the start of the machine stitches are, and we're going to go in just before that, because then we can anchor down our threads in that area. A knot in my thread as well. Gosh, this afternoon isn't going well, is it? Don't know how it is with you. We've got rain here over in Spain, and we are so desperate for it. We've been put on limits on the amount of water we can use in a day per household because we've got so little water. Not a problem we have in some of the European countries. I don't think the other ones a bit further north. You have a little bit too much rain, I think, sometimes. Right, and certainly in the UK where I used to live, they did. So now we're just going to hold on to these sides here, and I'm just going to take a bite out of each side, one at a time. Left and then right, or right and then left, it doesn't matter. But I'm just going to close that up so that this strip has no opening to it, and it's the same length, it's the same width all the way down. And if we're careful, we can do this and it'll be fairly invisible for us. That's what we want. Oops. We're getting caught up. nearly done. And then I just go a couple of stitches past the end, the open end, and into the machine stitches. And I find if I do that before then I start to do a couple of stitches in place to cast my thread off, then it takes the pressure off the end of the knot. So there we go, that's pretty much the same length all the way down. So let's do a couple of stitches along the same line as the machine stitches, just to anchor that down. Just a couple of back stitches, and then we can put the needle in the work and come out the other side, and that will give us a nice long tail to bury that thread. Okay. So this is what we're left with, which is this nice long strip. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our coat and we're actually going to press it now, because what I want to do is have everything really sitting really nice and flat for when we do our next bit of top stitching, because top stitching when you're using a dark thread through into this pale blue is going to show on both sides, and it's really difficult to get it lovely on both sides. So what I will do is I'm going to use dark blue in my top thread but light through on the bottom thread when I come to doing that. So I'm going to get my machine set up for that ready, and then I'm going to take my duffel coat over to the ironing board, and I'm going to iron that as flat as I can do, but I am going to use a press cloth for it, and I'd recommend you do the same, because last thing you want to do now is to scald or burn your precious fabric, well, your garment really, because it's a finished garment, isn't it now? So let's get this iron sorted out, and I'll show you how I press mine. I just go on to the pressing. I just wanted to show you that my duffel right front overlap has come out slightly longer, and I suspect it's the pulling it through that has made it slightly longer. Let me just hold it up against the pattern, look, and you can see how much extra it's running coming off the bottom there. I did add the seam allowance the same on the both sides, but I think just that pushing has just stretched it out a little bit. The other thing is that I'm noticing is that it isn't quite as wide as the actual finished one as well. So maybe my seam allowance, I've gone a little bit too far over on my seam allowance. It's not quite the same width. So I'm going to show you an alternative method that might well work for you. So I've got a pencil here. I'm going to actually trace off a replacement pattern piece, but I'm going to do it actually on the sewing line of the piece itself, or the finished cut out, sort of like the finished size that it should be. I'm then going to cut that out slightly wider in felt. So I think what I'll end up doing is, I've got that on there, yeah, is if I get a piece of felt, oops, put that away for a moment. And I'm still going to use 2 pieces of felt. Take off some of this paper, but not all of it. And you'll see the method in my madness in a minute. Those pieces. I am just thinking on my feet here, folks, so just bear with me. Let's get a piece of felt here. So I'm going to double this piece of felt over, and I'm going to just pin my paper pattern to it down the middle. For now, I can move those pins as we go along. So I'm just making sure that it's the right length all the way down. I'm then going to cut it out of my felt, not on the sewing line, but just slightly bigger. I'll show you in a second. I'll tuck away for a moment. I'll tidy up later, I promise. Okay, so there's my pattern with my sewn line on, cut on the felt and on the fold. It doesn't have to be on the fold, it can be a single pieces if you need to, just so long as that's slightly bigger. What I'm going to do now is I have changed my thread over, so I'm just going to change it back to my pale blue just really quickly. because then I'm going to sew over in pale blue first, and then we can always go over the line with the dark thread when we've finished in a minute or two. So let's just sew that, thread that up. Okay, so that's that order. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew down on each of these sides. So I'm not going to reverse. I'm not sewing on the sewing line. I'm sewing about 1/8 of an inch in from that sewn line. Let me take my stitch length up to 3 because it's, and I've got my presser foot on top of a pin, which is why it's not going anywhere. Hold on 1 second. It's because I'm making it up that you see it's not going quite to plan. And I am sewing through the tissue paper and through both layers of the felt. And we'll see if this works as an alternate button band. So when I get to the end here, I'm going to guesstimate where my 1/4 of an inch is going to be, or similar, and then I'm going to just turn, oh no, one more stitch, and then I'm going to turn, one more stitch, that's how I think it, that's it, and then down the other side. Estimate that at the other end as well. And then I'm going to try, I'm going to leave my stitches out because I'm going to join it by hand. Right, so what have I got here? So I've got my button, this is my button band on this cut line here. That's the actual stitch line that I've put on the inside, and then I've left my threads loose here, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull on the reverse of these stitches. So take at the one of the threads, and when you pull on it you'll see a little loop come. Don't know if you can see it here, but it's just there, and that's the thread coming through from the other side to form the stitch. And I'm going to just hook through that little loop and then pull it through so that all of my threads are finishing on this other side. So this one I won't be able to do, I'll have to do that with a needle. So let's get our needle, just thread it up with this one, because sometimes you can just pull it through, but if the like I did several stitches because my thread got caught because I was on that top of that pin to start off with, then it's just not happened for me. So now I'm going to make up, so I'm a stitch short in this corner, so I'm going to push that stitch in, that needle into there to finish off that stitch, and then I'm going to come up out of the hole of the previous stitch and then go back into that corner again. So I've just hand stitched those stitches there just to make them meet in the end, and then I'm going to tie a knot with my threads. 2 should do on this end. So this is just one set of threads, I've not done the other one yet, and then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to thread it down in the middle of this button band, so I'm not coming through one side, not coming through the other. And then when I take my threads in, I'm going to give it a little pull, and that should secure that thread inside there. I'm going to do that for all of them. So where's the second one? Sometimes you can put 2 threads through together. It just depends on whether they'll thread up properly. There's the other one. So I've still got my paper on. Just thread through there again. And snip. And now let's see if we can tie these 2 together twice. This is the other side of this. This is the either starting or the stopping threads, because don't forget you have threads to start and threads to stop. Snip that off. So basically this is going to be a button band with raw edges, because if you think about it, we've got raw edges on the yoke and we've got raw edges on the pockets. So actually having raw edge on the button band isn't as crazy as it might sound. So if I show you here, look, this is a raw edge here, that's not been finished, and this isn't been finished. So if we've got the button band down here and that isn't finished, I don't think that's going to cause too many problems. So now I'm going to cut out on the actual pencil line now, which is different to my stitch line. So let me take this down here nice and steady, because we want it to be nice and even all the way along. And this should give me the perfect size button band, which isn't too thick and it isn't too thin. And we can follow over the top of our already stitch lines when we do our top stitching, and that will replace the pale blue with the dark blue. Right, I'll save some of these bits of, I am a bit of a miser with my fabric, sorry. Right, so we've got this paper on the top, felt on the back, so that's our button band. So now what I'm going to do now is start with my quick unpick and just score it, and then that, whoops, and that should mean then that we should be able to just rip this paper off carefully through the stitches if we're careful, without yanking them too much, and that should give us a nice perfectly, and it is doing. Just take your time while you're ripping this paper off. Oh, the other thing you can do with the paper is if you've got, I've got a glass of water here. I saw this the other day as well. Again, another Instagram tip. Just wet the tissue paper slightly along those lines that you've got with the felt, and then it should tear away much easier for you without, and it does, look at that. So it was a tip for, was it English paper piecing, I think, or for applique. So you can just tear this paper out of the way. Yes, I'm making a mess, I know I am. I'll tidy up later, I promise. Right. We've got a very, very neat little flat button band. It's going to take you just a few moments just to get rid of all of this paper that's in the edging. But just wetting it slightly has helped, just means that it just tears away so much easier. Oh, I know what it was. It was foundation paper piecing they were saying to do it for. If ever you've seen that, where you've got you sew on the back of a template. So your fabric on the back is a quilting term. Just be careful with your stitches. You don't want to compromise any of those stitches if you can help it. Okay, I'll carry on doing that. You can see what mess I'm making. But it will all come off cleanly in the end like that. And then you've got this lovely neat button band, which I think I prefer. And it's certainly not as, it certainly fits better than the other one does. It's still got the same look, it's just got the raw edges here, but felt doesn't fray anyway, and that just matches what's on the pockets and what's on the yokes, so that's not going to bother me. Just get the rest of this paper out because it's going to bug me while I'm showing it you on camera, because it looks like I'm going to leave it, and I promise you I'm not. So yeah, so that will give you that lovely neat button band without the problem of having to turn it round. So it depends which way you prefer to go, because that's just two ways. I do try to give you other ways if I can think of them to make it slightly easier for you. Right, so let's go back to the pressing then. The first thing we're going to do now is we're going to press. I'm going to press both of these so you can see them both working, but I'm only going to use one, and I'm probably going to use my flatter one, because if you look at the difference in thickness between those two, you can see that this one's much bulkier for going through the machine than this one is. And if I sew straight over the top of these stitches when I do my top stitching, the navy thread should hide those stitches anyway for me. Right, let's have a go. So, first of all, pressing. Let's get our mat and our press cloth and our duffel coat. And I'm going to turn my temperature down just a little bit on my iron. I'm still keeping it on steam, but I've just turned it down slightly. Oops, just kicked the camera, sorry. And let's start with this back edge first, just here. So I'm going to just fold that so that the lining is to the inside. And then let's just take the iron and just give that a press on this back edge. And it should all start to sit quite nice and flat for us. Let's come along this front edge, make sure your corners are turned out, and they are. And again, we want that steam coming through just to press that nice and flat. So you can see a difference between where I've ironed and where I've not, or where I've pressed and where I haven't. On the front edge, make sure that your stitch line is right out on the edge there. Cover with your press cloth, and this is why I like this silk organza one, because you can see how much that covers over the edge there. Let's do the other side. So I'm just keeping it all flat on my press mat at the moment. Just letting the steam do its job. Let's take that up into the back of that duffel coat. Let's press our sleeves. Might as well while we're here. Just helps make it all look lovely, doesn't it? Oops. You've worked so hard on your coat so far. I mean, we've still got a little bit to do yet, because we've got those toggles to sort out and put on. That's going to be interesting. But the actual bulk of the garment sewing is now done. It's just all of those little finishing touches that's going to make it super special. So then on the edge of your hood, make sure you're right on the edge. That sewn line is right on the edge just there. Let's tuck our press cloth into the hood, and then we can press that flat too. And then just do this side just here as well. And the press cloth just stops you from scalding your fabric, and just from either melting it or from just from causing it stress really and damage. And then also once it's ironed, it's sitting so much flatter as well, which makes it much easier for us then to top stitch it. So we can put that steam on it and that iron on it, and that will then just make sure everything's all looking nice. Just iron from the inside on that lining, make sure that's all lovely. And you can hardly see where I've joined that lining gap just there. Look, that's all nice and neat. Okay, lovely big hood, look at that, really nice, really super that is, love it. Okay, so let me put this out of the way first, give me 2 ticks. Okay, let's get set up for some top stitching then now, because everything's all pressed and everything's fine. Now what you will notice is that you've got a bigger edge from your hood to the lapel on one side than you have on the other. When you lay it down in front of you, the right side, this side here is slightly longer, and that is because the other side will have this strip. So the left side has as you look at the garment, has the cover strip put down. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to start at this bottom edge here, which is going to get covered by the strip, and we're going to finish up at this edge at the end. So this is the theory. So I'm going to start on this bottom edge, and I'm going to then line up my machine with my top stitch threading. I've got a stitch length of 3 as well, so that we've got that extra length on the stitch, and I've got light blue thread in the bottom so it's not as obvious, and I've got my dark blue thread in the top for my top stitching. And I'm going to start following along the edge. Oh, and it doesn't want to move, so let's get my awl, and we can just put that in the fabric just behind, and that will just help pull it through a little bit. That's it. And I'm going to put my needle in my work. Okay, oh, my needle was in the work. Okay, I have got my glasses out so that we can be really careful with this, and I'm going to follow all the way along this bottom hem first, just taking my time and trying to make sure that my stitches stay nice and even. So if they get stuck on a hump through a seam allowance, then you might find you get a few smaller stitches. So just be prepared to help your fabric through your machine at that stage. Just make sure you try and stay nice and even, because top stitching is one of those things where it will show on the finished garment. So, well, obviously it will show, but if it's crooked or your stitching's a little bit wonky, then it will show. So we're going to stop now just on that edge, one more stitch. Okay. We're then going to leave our needle in the work, and we're going to lift our presser foot up, and we're going to pivot. So we've got that nice edge on the bottom here, but on the inside, can you see how that pale thread isn't showing if anything's a little bit off or a little bit wonky, because it's very difficult to get both sides as perfect as you might like. It's just law of nature. So let's put the presser foot down, and I used the point of my awl to just push into the fabric just to the side of the needle, so that I can just help that through as we start to go again. So you might not need to do that if you've got a walking foot on, you might be fine. And we're just making sure we've got the edge of the fabric nicely lined up. And yes, I'm holding my breath too. Going to go up to this top corner just here, and then we're going to pivot at that point as well. So just hand crank if you need to, just to make sure you're where you want to be. And then we're going to change direction and go in towards where the start of the hood is. Again, I've got my awl just to help that fabric through. Oops, that's it. Trying to keep at the same distance all the way through. And then I'm going to now pivot and go round the edge of the hood. Still keeping that same distance. And this will have pale blue on the inside, but I don't mind that. That's the look I'm going for with mine. Just helping the fabric through. Just take your time and just readjust as you need to. The important thing is not to come off the edge. You're not looking to come off the edge of your garment at all. Just make sure everything's all lying flat and straight for you. Then back down to where the hood joins the main garment. Take your time again. And then we're going to pivot across to this lapel. Right, we're going to stop just there. Now just be aware that on some machines you can actually press the foot up even higher. Can you see how mine's doing that double lift? Ignore the toe, the actual presser foot itself. So that's when it's down. That's when I lift it to release my fabric. But then I can also press it further up. Just see if yours will do the same, because we might need that for when we're attaching this next strip. So I've got my strip here. I've got my threads down at the bottom here. I tell you what, we're just going to, while this is in the machine, we're just going to neaten off these threads down here. So I'm just going to pull, oh, it won't pull through. So let me get this needle thread here. Take that thread off. Right, so what I'm going to do is, I've got my dark thread. This is all still in and all still connected. I'm now going to just thread the starting thread, which we didn't reverse with. We just started off, and I'm going to go directly in through the same hole and come out on the other side. So where the bobbin thread is. I'm then going to do 2 knots to tighten this off. And then I'm going to cut these off so these are both the same length, so I can thread them both into my needle at the same time. Excuse me just licking the ends of my thread, but it does work to help get everything through. And then I'm going to go straight into the edge of the behind the knot, and along the channel that I've made by the top stitching, just along the top here. I'll try and zoom in for you when I do the editing. Just take that back slightly because I'll have a little bit longer. And I'm going in between both sides of the fabric, so I'm not coming out here. You can't see the needle here, and you can't see the needle here apart from the top bit there. And then I'm going to come out and grab hold of my needle without poking myself. Sometimes you have to push on the end to get enough to pull. And then when I pull on those two threads, I should be able to pull that dark blue knot into the fabric so you can hardly see it. And that gives us a nice invisible start and stop without having to reverse. So that's how that's looking, all lovely and neat. So now what I'm going to do is, if I line up the end of my cover with the bottom of the fabric, maybe I should have tacked this on first, that would have made sense, wouldn't it? Maybe you need to tack yours on first. That's held on. Oops, ouch. Let's just put this one on here. Just making sure that I just barely cover the other edge. Put that on. And then I'm going to use that double lift to lift up my presser foot and tuck the end of that cover strip in, but I'm going to use a pin as well so that it can't shift further than where I want it to go. That's kind of got it. Okay. Really important now to use an awl or something, or just be very careful. You can use the end of your quick unpick, but just be careful you don't slide and rip through anything. I prefer the awl because there's no blade. So I've double lifted up my presser foot so I can start that cover strip on, and my stitches are going to be, my stitches in my dark blue are going to be right over the top of that pale blue stitching. So let's take a stitch forward, nice and carefully. There, we're onto it, that's good. And now following those stitches very carefully, nice and slow. If you see, I'm going really slow with this because this is right on the very front of the coat. As I come to my pins, I'm taking those out, but I'm not letting my cover strip slip off the edge of that coat. So it's a very precise bit of sewing, this is. If you wanted to, you could probably attach this by hand. If you'd done your top stitching around it first in the navy blue, you could probably then have attached this little strip by hand if you'd have wanted to. Across to the top, one more stitch, and now I'm going to go across the top of that band again to where I started. Oh, it's gone uneven in one place. Right, that's going to have to come out. Okay, so the theory was right, the practice was not. Look, I've got a wobble on my stitches just here and again here. You can see what I'm trying to do with that edging. On the inside here, we've still got the stitching coming down, holding it in place there. That's fine. So I won't undo that stitching on the far side. That's nice and neat. It's just this bit here where it's wobbled, look, and gone off the edge. So I'm going to redo that bit. But in theory, it's worked well because it's the cover slip is on. You could argue that it could have done with being a slightly higher at the top. No, let's take it off. Right, back in a minute. Okay, so I've just unpicked back to this edge of this lapel here with my top stitching. I'm going to pull that dark thread through to the inside of the garment again. And we're going to try a different way of attaching this strip for me. Again, if you're an experienced sewist, you perhaps will be able to sew that on first time round and it go really well for you. And if it does, that's absolutely brilliant and I'm thrilled. What I want to do is, though, just show you that it isn't always straightforward to do some things, but there's usually always another way. So I'm going to show those who might be beginners or slightly less experienced at top stitching how to get around this button band so you can still have that effect and that look, but without worrying about your wobbly stitches like mine were, because we all have days where things won't go quite right. And I try to stay authentic on my channel, and if I struggle, then you know there's a chance that a beginner might struggle as well. Obviously there'll be more experienced sewists than me watching these. Right, got them through. So again, through the channel at the top here, or down the side here, it doesn't matter. I'm going to go put my needle in right in where that knot is, and then just slide down inside between the two layers of the fabric, the felt, and then I'm going to just pull on those ends and pull that knot in, and it just gives you a really, really neat finish without any reverse stitching. But you've got to remember to have those ends. So if you've got a machine that cuts the ends off for you, it won't work. So that's just stopped dead just there. And on the inside it's nice and neat. You can see my stitches where I've just unpicked that, but that should just come straight out again. What I'm going to do with this is I'm going to make another one, but I'm going to actually go around it exactly the same way as I did this one, but I'm going to do it in dark stitches instead, and I'll have put a note on the screen when I'm doing it to say to make it with dark stitches. So let me just do that, and then we'll look at how we can attach this, and I'm probably going to do it by hand underneath so that that will sit on top all lovely. And I don't have to worry, because it'll give you the impression of the nice lovely straight top stitching if we do that in dark, and then it'll then all be nice. I will just go down here once with my top stitching first, yeah, just so I'll start again here and just do that so that from the inside it'll look the same as that side, because we want it both sides to look the same. So let's do that. Let's get hold of our threads. Sometimes when you're thinking about things, you're having to make it up as you go along and make it right. Okay, so let's get that nice edge. So again, I'm not going to reverse stitch just now, just starting right on that edge and going down, and this will give us that nice light blue edge on the inside. I'm going to stop right at my stitch where I started at the bottom down here with the top stitching. One more stitch. That should do. Right. There's my snips. So I'm going to finish these off as I did the other one. So that is just absolutely perfect. That's given us the blue stitching on the inside like that one is. I'm just going to make a new one of these and do that top stitching again, but in dark colour. Then I'll come back to you here. Hopefully you've already made yours like this. You can continue your top stitching without having broken your threads down the front, and then you'll join me again when we attach this band onto the front here to give us that lovely edge that we're going to have, that cover strip. And then we'll be ready to put our toggles on. Okay, back in a minute.